Your regulatory obligations don't cease once you get that FDA clearance or approval. Find something that might be exciting and see where that takes you. If you want to know your future, create it.
Right now, somewhere, a founder is popping champagne because they just got FDA clearance. Their investors are celebrating, their team is elated and maybe a little exhausted, and most of them have no idea that the hardest part is just beginning. Getting a medical device through the FDA is a massive achievement, but all too often teams think of it as the finish line when it's really the starting line. And the regulatory decisions that shape whether a product actually reaches patients, those start way earlier than most people think. Allison Komiyama has spent 15 years on both sides of that equation. First as an FDA reviewer, then building and selling her own regulatory consulting firm, and now running Blue Stocking Health, where she's on a mission to help innovators not just clear the FDA, but actually get their devices into the hands of the patients who need them. This is one of the most important conversations we've had on this show, and I'm really excited for you to hear it. Well, Allison, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I've really been looking forward to sitting down and talking with you, and so grateful that you're here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Of course. I'd love to do two things in this episode. I'd love to spend a large amount of time really exploring what early innovators should know about the regulatory landscape, about strategy, and really demystifying something that feels intimidating, that I think a lot of innovators early on think, well, I'll learn about that when the time comes, and I'll sort of think about that later. So I'm really excited to have you really boil that down. And before we get there, I'd love to explore how you got to doing what you're doing today, because not everyone starts out with a PhD in neuroscience and ends up as a health tech strategist. So I'm wondering if you could kind of walk me through the broad strokes of how you got started and how you got here.
You're right. I started where you are now. So I was at Stanford, had an amazing experience there. Knew around my fourth year that I did not want to stay in academia per se. Like I did not want to become a professor, and was trying to figure out what did I want to do next? Like what did I want to be when I grow up? And I started taking different courses, auditing. I took a patent law class, I took a business class, and then I took a history of FDA class with Hank Greeley, who's there at Stanford. And I was totally sold. I was just like, this is my future. I want to be somehow in regulatory. And so moved to
Not
DC.
a revelation that many people have.
No, people were like, how early did you know? I was like, yeah, kindergartners usually don't say, I want to be a regulatory or regulator when I grow up. Actually, my answer to that was I wanted to be a florist. So I still kind of have that creative side of things, but I decided that probably regulatory was more in alignment with what my career trajectory was looking like. I moved to DC, applied to a job at FDA, landed that, and that was really where I truly fell in love with the mission of the agency, really trying to help protect and promote. Everyone says that is at the heart of what they're doing, and I lived it. I loved it. And for a long time, I was there for just over a year. And so it's been 15 years almost since I was there. And someone told me, at some point, you got to stop saying that you worked at FDA. Like, give it a rest. When are you gonna move on? And so I really felt pretty sensitive about that. Sorry, I'm going off for a second, but I realized listening to your podcast and all of these innovators, one thing that I've noticed over and over again is when they talk about their origin, there's usually a turning point. There's like a pivot or something that really was like, this is it. Like, this is kind of the trajectory that completely changes their life. And that was FDA for me. And so even though it was just a brief period of time in my life, it was so impactful. I really loved my colleagues. I loved the devices I was, reviewing. I was also doing research in the Office of Science and Engineering labs. And so just that entire experience really set me on the trajectory of staying in regulatory. So after I worked at FDA, I moved to San Diego. My husband got a job here at UC San Diego, and I'm from San Diego, so it made sense to be moving home. Otherwise, I honestly probably would still be at FDA. I mean, there's been so much turmoil and so much that has changed in the past year, 2 years, but I loved it. I loved every bit of my time at the agency. So I decided to first work in an in vitro diagnostic company doing their regulatory submissions, sort of in like my cooling off year is what they call it, where you're not supposed to touch anything that you worked on at the agency. Not that there wasn't too much that I was worried about with conflict, but still, I worked in an IVD company. After a year there, I applied for a consulting job. So I found a company based in San Diego that was doing submissions to the agency, a lot to the group that I had been working with at FDA. And so I was like, that's where I want to work. So I cold called them, worked there for just over 2 years before starting my own company. That was called Acknowledge Regulatory Strategies, the longest name, and I would not recommend anyone picking such
I
a
mean, it
long
has
name.
a little bit of a ring to it.
It does, but man, it was the email. I was, trying to. I realized not many people know how to spell acknowledge. Anyway, it was just me for 2 years. I really wanted to focus on smaller startups. I really enjoyed working on novel technologies and getting to see them take it from, a design or even just a sketch or an idea all the way through FDA. So grew that company. That was about 7 years later, ended up selling that company to a larger consulting company. It was the right move at the time. I was there 4 years and then recently have moved on to working for a regulatory law firm. So I'm still kind of keeping my foot in the regulatory world, but I'm more on as a strategist in that company. My passion project right now is really blue stocking health. That's my new baby. I started it in end of last year, end of 2025, and just am having a lot of fun. And so, I'm sure we'll talk some more about that. But that's been my arc, sort of random and wonderful.
I love the way you sum that up, random and wonderful. One of my mentors said once, the wobbly path is the best path, and I always think about that. And another way of saying random and wonderful.
Yes. Yeah, my dad always I was raised with the mantra, if you want to know your future, create it. And he would always say that to us, my sister and myself, before we'd, head out for school. And every day it was like, how do I want to create this day? What is it that I want to accomplish? And still doing it. I said earlier, what do I want to be when I grow up? And I still don't think I know. I feel like that's one of those things that I hope to never figure out because it is kind of fun to pivot, try something else, find something that might be exciting and see where that takes you.
Gosh, I love that. And what an incredibly empowering thing for a child to hear
Mm,
on a daily basis from their parent. That's wonderful.
yeah.
Well, before we shift gears and start to kind of unpack the nuts and bolts of what innovators might want to be thinking about in this space, would you be able to give us a little taste of what you're doing with Blue Stocking right now
Sure. Yeah.
with your new company?
So Blue Stocking Health is sort of born of, I guess, my trajectory thus far, in that I kept watching companies make these amazing devices, getting it through FDA, really helping them navigate the regulatory process. And then I would say, "All right, see you later. Like, I can't wait to see what comes of your device and your success." And unfortunately, too often I was seeing them thinking that the FDA clearance or approval was the finish line. Like, we did it, right? And I treated it as that because that was my job. And I realized that's kind of the starting line, like, of the next phase. I think a lot of founders, a lot of teams will not maybe have thought so much. Maybe they've thought about reimbursement or trying to think of some of the strategy for the next phase, but really implementing that, getting people to know about the technology, I felt there was a gap there. And I being so in love with the mission of FDA, I am a total FDA fangirl. I still feel very much with the folks that I've worked with over the years that I was part of the protecting public health, right? I wasn't going to let the companies get through, or if they were going to try and say, well, do we really need to do that test? I could say, well, yeah, you do, right? So, um, but then the promotion piece, I feel like, especially in the last year or two, with a lot of the changes that at the agency, that promotional piece has been also missing. So not only did I see founders kind of flounder after they get their FDA approval, but I've also seen FDA not be as excited or forthcoming. I mean, that's not their job necessarily, is to get super excited. But even a lot of the press releases that we used to see come out of the agency at least would drum up some excitement or enthusiasm around these new technologies. Not that I feel, as one person, I can completely change the trajectory of, what's going on in medtech. But I feel like if there's any way that I can amplify their message, if I can get patients to understand what technologies are available to them, and maybe it's not always a drug, maybe it's a combination with a drug and a device. I think everyone benefits, is just having the knowledge and having that understanding that, hey, maybe there's other things that could benefit me.
Allison, I love how you put that with the FDA approval just being the starting line. And I think this is a great place to pause. And I want to come back to that in a little bit. For this next step, I'm wondering if we could kind of unpack some of the language, because it really is like its own entire language that people learn as they go on this journey. So for folks who are listening to this podcast who maybe haven't invented their first device yet, but know that this is the world that they want to live in one day, I'm wondering if we could walk through a couple of the vocab basics. And if that's okay, maybe you could walk through what we mean when we talk about 510K or de novo or PME or IDE, just so our audience knows. And if we use this language later, they'll kind of know what we're thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, people teach courses on this entire topic because there's a lot to learn out there. And I realize a lot of the, entrepreneurs and the folks that I've worked with over the years, if they are not so committed to one pathway, and oftentimes I'll say, let's talk about what are the indications you want for your device? Tell me about your device. Tell me what would be the ideal outcome for you. There's often ways that we can figure out the regulatory strategy around it. I often feel folks think, and I suppose rightfully so, in engineering and in science, there's usually two, it's binary. Like there's two ways to do this and you have to pick one or the other. And I think for regulatory, there's often 5 different pathways. And so really figuring out, here's the spectrum of things that you could do. Here's the risk associated with each, or risk being time and money. How sure are we that FDA is going to agree to this 2 years down the line when we come back? And so really understanding what are the various pathways, and then understanding what's the appetite for not only your team but the investors is really valuable then to say, okay, here's the language that you need to learn. It's almost like figuring out, once you have the strategy, here are the key phrases that you need to know. I think the most common ones are, of course, as you said, 510K, de novo, PMA, right? And when we're talking about medical devices specifically, there's 3 classes of devices. I often think of this as like the big Venn diagram of class 1 being lower risk, class 2 being moderate, and then class 3 being oftentimes your life-sustaining or life-supporting devices and the highest risk devices.
And if
For
we want to put examples in there, a stethoscope would be
class
a low
1,
risk.
low risk device offered. Electronic stethoscopes, however, are ones that are going to be using some sort of software functionality or AI in order to be an adjunct or to help with the diagnosis of something. Class 2, the second that you throw a heart valve in there, or AEDs, the defibrillators, those are class 3 PMA devices. It typically aligns with the 510Ks. Most of those are class 2 devices. PMAs, which is the pre-market approval process, is mostly for class 3 devices. But again, that Venn diagram, there are some class 1 devices that need a 510K. There are some class 2 devices that don't need a 510K. There are some class 2 devices that, FDA upregulates and needs a PMA. So there's always exceptions. And I feel like for the most part, we can speak in generalities of like most class 2 devices are a 510K. The de novo process is sort of that unique submission type that is uh, likely your device is a moderate risk device, but that there's no predicate, right? Nothing that is truly substantially equivalent or that you can demonstrate substantial equivalence to. And so in those cases, historically, FDA would say, well, that's a PMA. If you don't have a predicate, you're going to be submitting a pretty massive file to FDA. And instead, FDA said, well, why don't you ask us for automatic reclassification when you submit that pre-market submission? It's funny because I feel at FDA, I've heard reviewers call de novos mini PMAs, and a lot in industry will say like, oh, it's just a 510K on steroids. So I think just depending on who you talk to and the amount of evidence that is needed to submit that to FDA will really determine, how long it's going to take and how much work, how much effort.
Mm. You've spoken before about your philosophy to be thinking about this almost from the very beginning. What would you tell someone who is perhaps a grad student with deep expertise and is beginning a brainstorm? At what point do you suggest that someone starts to think about these different pathways, and how does that shape the design process once someone has the rough contours of an idea but is trying to sort of bring it into the world?
Sure. I will often say it's never too early to start thinking about regulatory because regulatory can definitely impact a lot of the decisions that are made early on, right? And I think when you're looking at your user needs and often the design inputs for a product that you're building, if you allow regulatory in early, there can be just minor tweaks early on that can really make your life a lot easier down the line. There was a saying of, if there's an asteroid from far away and it's coming closer, it's easier to tip it off, course way out in far away outside our orbit than when it's really close and about to hit us, right? So I think if you can change the trajectory of certain things, again, that are maybe it's going to be a lot of testing, or maybe there's going to, one path doesn't need clinical and the other path does need clinical. Those are really extremely valuable from a time, resource, money perspective for early startups. I think the other thing to keep in mind is you don't need regulatory all the time necessarily. So oftentimes I, would work with inventors and I know on you had a recent person that you talked with that worked at the Texas Medical Center and I've done a lot of work with the incubator and team there, and it's so fun because it's early and they will talk to me for an hour, 2 hours, and then I don't hear from them, right? And I wouldn't hear from them for 6 months to a year. They would come back around and say, all right, we took all the things that you said, we've set these things in motion. And it was like, perfect. Now it's time to re-engage. Now it's time to talk again. And let's start getting ready for your pre-market submission, either your 510K or your de novo or your PMA. So I think the luxury of having a full-time regulatory person or a full-time quality person is often not there for a lot of the smaller startups. But I think that's fine. Just get some input early. I also, I'm fascinated when companies would come to me and say, "Oh, we got this early regulatory feedback and it was terrible. And so we're looking for a new regulatory person." And I would say, "Well, tell me what the feedback was, and or tell me what they said or that how they put what they told you that really you're upset about." And 9 times out of 10, I would say, "No, that's actually really good feedback." Maybe there's other, pathways. As I said, there might be 5 different pathways. So maybe you didn't know the other 4, but it was always a red flag to me when companies were like, "We hate our regulatory person." Because I'm like, you know, yes, there are some, consultants out there that might not be that great, but for the most part, it's like, no, listen to it, and maybe like we talk about in medicine, get a second opinion. And I think, a mark of a good regulatory consultant or a good regulatory team member, if you have somebody in house, is that they're open to hearing other people's ideas, weighing that and saying, is that something that is critical, or could we push that down the road, or just communicating in general.
The example that you just shared of maybe not even being aware of all the other pathways available in a given situation, I think it can be intimidating for early innovators having a sense that they don't know what they don't know. And I'd love to know, what are some ways that a team can sort of lock themselves into a regulatory pathway early in the product decision stage as they're making design decisions without even recognizing it?
Great question. Oftentimes, it has to do with the patient population or the indication you're going after. So, FDA is sectioned, or at least I should say, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, or CDRH, is broken into 8 different DHTs, or divisions of health technology. And each DHT is then broken then again into various offices of health technology. And when you look at how they've, I don't want to say siloed themselves, but how they've organized themselves into these various offices, you can start to understand which group you might be going to and in within your submission. And really understanding if you're going to have, let's say, a surgical tool, general surgical tool, or if you're going to make it very specific for a certain type of surgery, whether it be OB-GYN, right? Or if it's going to be cardiovascular, right? A cardiac device. Knowing that, what's that team that you're going to be communicating with? And is that the right indication? Is that the right group that you want to start with? So not maybe, an FDA shouldn't be the ones that are really dictating your entire business plan for a technology. But I even think to like even just generic devices of bone graft, right? And certain bone grafts are regulated differently by the different OHTs, right? Whether if it's dental or if it's going to be spine and orthopedics. So really understanding who's your patient, who's going to be using the device, and then figuring out, is that a new indication, right? Where there might be in a certain office at FDA, they might already have devices that do a similar technique or a similar technology as yours. And that might be a lower hanging fruit than going into a completely new space, which might be very exciting and very sexy for investors, but might be a higher regulatory hurdle or bar that you have to achieve. And so talking to somebody who really understands, like, here's the various landscape of the agency, and also tell me what your hopes and dreams are. Usually I'll say, like, what do you want? Like, what would be your ultimate dream to get this to market, or who's your ideal patient? And then starting to ask questions around, is are you married to that? Or could we, is there maybe sometimes there's actually a strategy to start with pediatrics, right? A lot of the pediatric submissions, while it's a harder population oftentimes to study, there are certain benefits that for companies that target pediatric populations first. And so the agency might help shape that decision, where then it would be easier to expand and extrapolate into an adult population from there. So I think, to your question, not being so married to this is the ultimate thing that I have to have, but maybe allowing regulatory to say, okay, maybe there's another strategy once we get, let's say, clearance over here, because this is, this group knows this technology very well. Maybe it's an easier step, like the stepwise approach, to then take your technology into a new space that isn't really familiar with what you're building. So I often will see companies even start with a 510K, right? The Me Too pathway, which I it's really the substantial equivalence pathway of, there's a device that's similar to us, same intended use. And now that we have this device cleared, we're actually going to go for totally different intended use. And that's going to be a de novo, but the technology is going to stay the same. So there might be strategy that makes your path a lot easier. And if you haven't locked yourself into, this is the only thing that we can say yes to.
Hmm. When I hear some of the bigger picture thinking behind a lot of these decisions and strategy, I sometimes have the sense that there may be an alignment of spirit and wanting patients to do well, of course, between innovators and FDA, but sometimes there may be differences in the way both sides think about things. I'm curious when the FDA thinks about risk benefit, what are they actually weighing that may be different from the way that founders are thinking about that with their device?
Yeah. I always quote one of the ombudsmans at FDA who says FDA are paid skeptics, right? They are going to look at the risks of your device and make sure that they can sleep at night, right? If they approve your device or clear your device. And I know that is a huge frustration for a lot of founders and a lot of investors, right? Because they think of FDA as being this group that's stifling innovation, that's not really helping get these innovations through. And in the same breath, you can say, well, they're also making sure that you're not putting something through that's going to cause, significant risk that's going to maybe outweigh the benefit. The unfortunate side, I think, is we often will hear more about the failures of medical devices than we hear about the successes and the benefits that they have. There's documentaries all about the failures of certain device types, and very rarely do we hear about good job FDA, like you you let this device through and it saved 5,000 people's lives in the past year, and and it's just, I mean, for many reasons that's not a story that gets amplified or talked about. So I think companies will often lead with benefit, right? They're usually not developing a product that is, uh, okay, let's think about the risks of this device before we think about the benefits. And so it's usually, gosh, this is going to really help my practice if it's a physician that's developing something, or this is something that's really going to help a large patient population because we could see the trajectory of it and this disease, and we know that this is going to be a device that we need. I think one of the presenters that you had recently was talking about just skin cancer, right? There's a dearth of dermatologists in the US, and there's such a need for screening and making sure that we can identify certain skin lesions. And I think that's, understanding that need and seeing the benefit is what most innovators will go, forward with. And then FDA is going to look at that same technology and say, what is the risk of screening early? What is the risk of having too much information? Because that also can be very problematic for, whoever is either using the device or the patients. I know there's always a big debate around patient monitoring, especially for infants, right? Of like, if we're allowing parents or caregivers to really, have 24/7 monitoring of their child, there's benefit to that, right? Especially for some populations that may say, this is something that is really important to me. I sleep so much better at night knowing that my baby has, a device hooked up to them and is monitoring them. And then there's going to be parents or caregivers that are just constantly checking the device and the app, and that it becomes exhausting and stressful, or you over rely on something. And so I think having FDA be the agency that's asking those hard questions is so important. Someone told me once, they're like, you're like my regulatory therapist, because you like, or even like like you help us understand what FDA is trying to tell us or ask us, because oftentimes the knee-jerk reaction is, "Oh, they don't understand our device. What jerks. They're just trying to, like, why would they ask this question?" And if you can come at it with like, "Well, here's why. Here are the questions, or they need to ask these questions." And then talk to FDA and say, "I understand these questions, but and we'll address it, but maybe think about also the benefit. Don't regulate or don't review to the one event or to the very rare event of something bad happening. Also think about the potential benefit for this to really help a lot of patients." And so getting people to kind of see eye to eye has been just a goal that I've had for since I've started in this space.
I want to dig more into these kind of interactions that you help broker sometimes between people that you work with and the FDA. What does a good interaction with the FDA actually look like from their side of the table when inventors are told, start talking to the FDA or talk to the FDA early, or like what does that actually look like? How should that play out?
So there is the pre-submission process, which everyone talks about, or Q-submission process. It is a fantastic opportunity for companies to approach FDA, either ask questions or there's informational meetings where you can just go and show that your device and have FDA interact with it. I would say sitting on FDA's side of the table, I remember the best meetings were ones where they piqued my interest, right? It was a cool device. They really sold it to me. Also, they explained the patient population. I was not, an expert in any disease, I would say, for when I went to work at FDA. And so first, not spending too much time, but saying, here's the disease population, or here's the condition, here's maybe the trajectory of the disease and how it's going to impact Americans in the next 5-10 years. Here's what the current standard of care is, or the current, what people are actually doing in the space. And here's where our device fits into this. And so to really tell that story and making it clear to FDA that this is not just yet another mousetrap. There's going to be, maybe improvements, or there's going to be something that I can feel proud of as a reviewer, helping you get through the agency or get through the regulatory process. So I always felt the best meetings were the ones where I left feeling like I was a stakeholder. I felt like I want to see them succeed. And yeah, I'm going to ask them tough questions. This isn't going to be just, easy cakewalk, but it's going to also be something that at the end of the day, I want to see you launch your product and help people. I think from the other side of like now sitting at this side of the table, or working with companies and really trying to help them prepare for those meetings with FDA, it's usually don't shout, don't get angry with the agency, even you might feel it, you just scream in your heart, as they say. I tell that to my daughter. I'm like, just scream in your heart. Don't be screaming out loud, please, because there may be things that are frustrating, but you can always say, that's a great question. We don't have an answer right now, but we will work on that, or we will take that into consideration. I think FDA often wants to be heard. They want their responses or their feedback to be acknowledged. Does it need to be, does everything need to be addressed? Maybe not. So I think if you know that the other side of the table is also a bunch of humans, right? And we're all doing our best. I think, as much, especially today and with the agency being tight on resources and a lot of people left last year. I think it's really one of those moments of like, how can we work together to get this ultimately across the finish line, or as I said, across the starting line. So those would be the best interactions, the ones where everyone feels like, let's do this together.
Allison, I want to come back to something that you said earlier that you actually just touched on right now, which is this being at the starting line. So many times in the world of medical training and the world of health tech, you're climbing this big mountain. You got to the top of it, and then the fog clears, and you see that actually the mountain's still towering over you. When a team hits this major milestone and they get FDA approval, that really is like an incredible milestone to reach. When you are thinking about how folks cannot take their eye off the ball and how that's in some ways the starting line, as you put it, what else should they be thinking about moving forward from a regulatory perspective that people may not recognize in the moment?
Yeah, your regulatory obligations don't cease once you get that FDA clearance or approval, right? It is, and oftentimes folks will in the same breath say regulatory and quality, right? RAQA. And they go hand in hand, because as you're making changes to your device, or as you might want to clarify things in labeling, there's always the regulatory consideration. Does this change trigger a new 510K? Is this something that could introduce a new risk or change the risk profile in some way? So I think,
just to interrupt real quick, could you share an example of what that might be for someone who's saying, how could I change the entire pathway just from making a tweak?
sure. Yeah, I think I'll give an example for digital health devices. I've done a lot in the digital health space, even just changing some of the user interface, right? From a design perspective, it may just seem like, oh, this is just a simple color change, or we want to change some parts of the logo, and it sounds so mundane, and like this isn't a big deal. And then it rings a bell because we had a company say, oh, we want to change things to red and and have this color palette. And then when the regulatory person that they had brought in house said, well, what about people who are colorblind, right? Like a huge population for this condition are male and maybe may have color blindness. It's going to be really hard for them to understand what's on the screen if we make that change. So even just having that team together to ask those questions and say, is this something that really is for clarity purposes, or really is, we have to make this change. Maybe it's a material change that isn't, a device that's not touching the patient, or a component that's not touching the patient. Is that something that actually off gases something that could impact that? So it's almost like going down that rabbit hole, doing the root cause of just like, is this something that could be a problem? Because who knows when you think about the goal of a quality system is really to always be improving your quality system. So it's like looking at, is there a way that we can make things better? Is there a way that we can, make sure that we're getting the best product we can into the users who need to use it? So I love thinking about that stuff. So I think that's one way that companies can often think about, making sure that they're maintaining their regulatory and quality obligations. I think also one of the things that FDA has implemented in the past year or two is the predetermined change control plan, which really started off as like something for AI and software changes. If you're going to make changes, let's say to your algorithm, if it's software as a medical device. And so FDA essentially said, if you submit kind of the guardrails, if you explain to us what could be the changes that you're going to make moving forward to your product, and how are you going to test that and make sure that it doesn't necessitate a new 510K, because FDA doesn't want to review a new 510K from you every day if you're going to keep improving, let's say, your algorithm. And FDA has been clearing and granting and approving these documents, these PCCPs, as part of the pre-market process, and allowing companies to take that responsibility, I don't want to say offline, but like away from FDA. So FDA doesn't have to keep putting more resources into new 510Ks when it is something that the company can manage within that framework, within those guardrails. So I think there's just a lot of really interesting opportunities, and FDA keeps changing, regulations change, and I think it's, again, hopefully it's for the better, right? Like hopefully we keep making it so that it's not such a time suck for FDA reviewers, and also a resource suck for the companies. We really don't want them to be having to submit a 510K every time they make a minor change.
Well, Allison, this has been so special talking to you, and I just want to tell you how just incredible this advice is, and how grateful I am for your time. Where can people go to learn more about you and everything that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Easiest place to always find me is on LinkedIn. I'm very present and having a lot of fun on LinkedIn with Blue Stocking Health. I'm also available with Duval and Associates, which is a regulatory law firm, and I'm working there as a strategist. So any of those venues work. And so if people reach out to me, I'm always so happy to nerd out with people.
We'll have your info linked up in the show notes below for everyone, and encourage everyone to reach out to you and to check out what you're putting out in the world. Really, really neat videos on your LinkedIn page.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.